Hello and welcome to the Monster Mechanics Podcast, where we take creatures of myth and media and see how they can be improved. I am your host, Scott Paladin, and with me as always is the SpongeBob to my SquarePants, Zach Jaquays. What are we talking about today, Zach?
This week we're talking about the Leviathan.
So the Leviathan is, it's originally a Hebrew word, so most people will have heard it in a biblical context if you're a Western listener of ours. The actual etymology of the name comes from something like wreath or twisted coils, something like that. And that is described in kind of vague terms because it seems to be a very, very old legend. In fact, you can make arguments because there are similar creatures in a bunch of different mythological and religious contexts, that this is a legend that maybe predates a lot of those and had been passed down from previous, cultures and from previous incarnations. So you could roughly equate the Leviathan to Jormungandr of Norse myth, or there's another one which was unnamed, which is from a Middle Eastern. Excuse me. Actually, I want to make sure I get this right. Yeah, Mesopotamia. So there's also a Mesopotamian legend about Baal Hadad, or the Baal cycle, where he defeats a great creature. There's also the Tiamat of more Eastern myth, Near East, excuse me. So there's this sort of interesting equation of the giant sea serpent, for lack of a better term, that really shows up in a lot of different cultures. And we're not going to be talking about any one in particular because none of them are really clearly well defined. There isn't a big long description of any of these. They're all just sort of vague notions. But the idea of this giant serpentine sea monster is common enough that I think we can do some work with it.
Oh yeah.
If you're a Western mildly religious person, or somebody who was raised in a religious household, you might know of Jonah and the whale, which in some versions it's the Leviathan that swallows Jonah. In another version, there's Jonah is swallowed by a giant fish, and then the Leviathan eats the fish, which I think is interesting. I hadn't heard that one before. But just the idea of there being this huge serpent-like or possibly tentacled creature that lives deep beneath the waves and sometimes will swallow people or other creatures or whole ships, I think is wild. I think we can totally work on that.
So while you've been talking about this, there's been some cogs spinning in my brain.
Oh yeah,
with the etymology springing from twisted or wreathed or
yeah.
And I hate to step on Junji Ito's toes, but the idea of spirals,
yeah.
comes to mind, and I wonder if there's something that could be done with that.
Well, and spirals appear a lot in nature. I mean, that's a thing that Ito pulled off of it, but it's not unlikely that spirals could form something about the body of this creature. Is maybe it's a giant coil, or that unravels or something like that. Have you seen the there's a species of broccoli that has these little spirally cones on it?
I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
I mean, Romanesco broccoli.
Oh yeah.
That is wild looking. That looks like an alien plant to me.
Absolutely.
And it's apparently tasty. But the fractal nature of that would be very cool. If you could imagine each one of those clusters, these little fractal spirals, these little spiny things, you could imagine them unraveling and turning into tentacles or something along those lines, and just becoming this writhing fractal mass of appendages. That would be wild.
Yes, the deep sea broccoli monster.
Man, we're gonna struggle a little bit because any wild ass crazy thing that we come up with is probably going to have been outdone by nature already somewhere deep in the sea.
There's that.
Whatever horrible nightmare monster you can come up with, that thing probably exists and is also glowing at the bottom of the ocean somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I definitely like the idea of this thing having a very strange body type. All of the phylums, the normal body shapes that we see up here on the surface of animals, half of those don't exist down in the depths where I imagine this thing's from. And, making this thing, very strange would be great. And there's always more room for strange discoveries at the bottom of the ocean, like the giant tube worms that exist around geothermal vents were only discovered in the 1970s, and they're these 9-foot-long worms that like survive in boiling water that's full of acid, and that's what they use to survive because they use chemogenesis instead of photogenesis. But no, chemosynthesis instead of photosynthesis, and so they survive in complete blackness, and they release their spores to float through the ocean until they can find a different geothermal vent to live around. It's wild.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Now, if we're talking about a big creature, like something that's huge, like we're talking about, I mean, like I want to say kaiju level, right? Like this thing is multiple ships lengths long. Like I want something that could take out a tanker, an oil tanker, right? Mm-hmm. It seems to be huge. I do need to bring up the concept of, it's sometimes called the biomass pyramid and sometimes called the energy pyramid, which is this a concept. I'm not sure exactly how widespread it is, but it's the idea that like within a particular area, most of the biomass is going to be at simpler, lower levels of the food chain, right? So if you were to take a cross section of a forest, for example, most of the biomass in that forest is trees and grasses and plants. Mm-hmm. And then I do not know the exact ratios here, but it's something like 70 to 80% of it is going to be that. And then like 70 to 80% of the remainder is going to be things like bugs and insects and worms, and like just one level up on the food chain. And then, so that's already like 70 to 80% of the remainder. And so then 70, 80% of the remainder of that, which now we're talking about 5, maybe 6% of the total, is going to be things that would then eat the bugs, which are going to be birds and rabbits and things along that level of complexity. And then when you get to like the things that feed on the rabbits and the birds and the squirrels and things like that, like things like foxes, they're going to be even less than that. Like they're going to be this tiny little sliver of a sliver. And so if you are going to have an area that sustains large predators, then they have to have a lot of life there available to them. And you can even sort of kind of do backwards calculations to look at a particular area and say, okay, what's the largest predator that we could expect to see? And so, you know, if we've got a lot of grass, maybe that can sustain several herds of bison. A couple of those herds of bison can sustain one group of wolves. And so if you want to have a very, 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 very large creature, something like whales, for example, then you have to have a suitably large source of food for them, is basically how it breaks down to. So you have to imagine that in a world where the Leviathan could exist, the oceans would have to be teeming with life in order to like be a big enough ecosystem to sustain this thing. Unless we get all the way around that, and this is why I brought up giant tube worms, unless the Leviathan itself is like, it is the first level. It is that first level of biomass where it is getting its energy directly from the environment instead of predating on other life forms.
Interesting. And
if it's that, usually in most environments would require photosynthesis. It would have to like be a big plant, you know, like Pando. One of the largest or heaviest living organisms on the earth is Pando, a cloned cluster of spruce trees in Colorado, if I remember correctly. We brought up Pando previously on the podcast, so I'm having to pull this from memory. But like Pando is on that first level, and that's one of the reasons why mathematically it can be so big, is because it doesn't rely on other life in order to sustain itself.
Sure.
But there's an alternative to photosynthesis, again brought up by the giant tube worms, which is chemosynthesis, where using complex sulfides being spewed out by the Earth's crust in like geothermal vents, you can arrange yourself in a way that you can turn that into accessible energy and food. And that's exactly what the huge amounts of life that are around geothermal vents do, is that they turn those chemicals directly into energy for themselves by like essentially chemical processes and heat.
Interesting. So in this case, you're thinking of Leviathan as like a colony of worms, or?
I'm thinking like a superorganism. Like it's not laid out like we would, like a human, like a vertebrate would be. Like it doesn't have a central nervous system. It's more like a starfish or something along those lines, where it's built up of little chunks. And then you brought up the idea of spirals, and then that led us to the fractal broccoli.
Sure.
So maybe this is an organism which is halfway between a colony and an organism. Like it's it's a little bit more like a jellyfish, where it's made up of all of these cells that are not specialized the way that they are in animals and a lot of plants, but that they do act in concert with one another. And so they are contiguous with one another. So like it sort of blurs that line between this is a colony of individuals and this is a single organism.
Sure.
That could be very cool. And then we could imagine it. I'd sort of imagine this as like it had tentacles that was cramming into geothermal vents in order to get more and more of the heat and more of those chemicals. And then it had like this massive organism, football fields long and like the size of a skyscraper, right? Just beneath the ocean, like deep into the ocean. And it has like found one of those geothermal vents, like where the Earth's crust is splitting apart from the convective currents of the mantle, where we're having this is the origin of continental drift, where it's making new seafloor at the rate of like an inch a year or something like that, whatever at the rate that fingernails grow, right? That's what's pulling this apart. And it is like wedged itself deep into this crevasse and has like infiltrated all of these geothermal vents in order to get the heat and the chemicals out of the water before anything else can.
So at the heart of this, we're still talking about monsters. So what makes the Leviathan a threat?
Well, I mean, obviously, if you get down into its territory, I think it's on the lookout for nutrients and chemicals and stuff like that. So obviously, a submarine that got too close would be a threat. Would be threatened by it. But the scenario that I had imagined was a particularly large earthquake or some sort of disruption of the Earth's crust where it had been embedded itself, just dislodges this thing and sends it floating up towards the surface. And since its proclivity is to seek heat anyway, it moves itself towards the surface because it thinks that it's heading towards a geothermal vent, but instead it is heading towards the surface of the ocean. And then when this thing rises to the surface, it is flailing about and basically just trying to survive. And in that scenario, it becomes incredibly dangerous to anything nearby. And it's huge, and it's got these tentacles which could be miles long. Like they're meant to go deep into the Earth's crust and to wind their way through crevices and cave systems. And like you could be nowhere, you maybe wouldn't be able to see the main body of this thing, but still be attacked by its tentacles as it flails about, looking for something to grab onto.
Interesting. Do you think there's also like a chance that like this thing also has photosynthesis, but because it's just been underwater so long, like it just hasn't sought that out. Like it's just been so secluded from sunlight. But like when it's introduced to sunlight, suddenly it has a new food source basically, and like can blanket the surface of the ocean.
My inclination is, I mean, if we're going from like a biological evolutionary side of things, then the answer would be typically no, because if a creature survives entirely in darkness, then there is almost no reason for it to keep around the apparatuses, the chemical processes it would need, any kind of specialized cells, anything like that. All of those, if they're not doing any good, then they might as well just get rid of it in order to save energy. And so maybe you have to come up with another explanation for why it could suddenly photosynthesize.
Sure.
You could maybe make the argument that it does both. Like the amount of light that gets down to the bottom of the ocean is not zero, but it is very, very, very small, vanishingly small. So maybe the one of the ways it supplements its chemosynthesis digestion is also by maybe having like it blankets an entire city-sized area with like tendrils that like those things catch a couple of photons each, and it turns that into energy as well. And so it's got these mechanisms there. It's using that as not it's not that its sole food source. It's not even like its primary food source, but it's using it as an option just to kind of supplement. And so that when it gets to the surface, it has some of that capability, and it's super sensitive to it because it's having to wring every little tiny bit of energy about any light that it gets a hold of. Yeah. So you could maybe make that argument.
Because I'm picturing like this scenario where like sailors are sailing along in their ship or whatever and come across like this fractal tentacle sphere like miles and miles wide, just sitting on the surface of the ocean with like all these tendrils just miles into the air.
And the thing is, I don't think it needs to photosynthesize to make that exact behavior, because what it's doing in that scenario is it's unraveled its fractal nature. Like it's spread itself out because it's looking for a new thermal vent. And during the day, the hottest thing around is the sun. And so it's shoving its tentacles up out of the water, literally trying to grab the sun because it needs to get because that's where it would normally get its nutrients and its energy from, is from the heat source. And so these things would be flying up in the air, these like huge tentacles, tens and hundreds of feet in the air maybe. And then they might have a secondary like impulse, because this thing's not smart, it's not thinking, but it is reacting to this environment around it. And so maybe if you get close to one of these things, the secondary impulse, like one thing is it needs to get to a heat source. It wants to get to the warmth. But the other thing is it needs to grab onto stuff in order to secure itself. Yeah. And so maybe in absence of something to grab onto, it reaches towards the sun. But if you get your boat a little too close to one of these tendrils, it goes, oh, hey, that's a rock face. And it just like grabs you and like wraps around you and starts trying to it's not trying to crush you. It's just trying to grab a hold of what it thinks is the sea, or what would normally be the seafloor for it. But instead it's your boat, and you are not made of rock. And so it crushes you and pulls you under just as an autonomic response.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah, that is a cool idea. I also like the idea that maybe it has some built-in mechanisms for like defending its vents that it's found from other seafloor creatures. And so like it might think, oh, that's not a boat. That's some creature trying to steal my heat.
Yes. Or even being sort of like opportunistic predator, where it most of the time other creatures aren't going to be down near it. But if any of them get close enough, it'll go ahead and grab them and just like pull them into itself in order to be digested. And so it's not like that. Again, that's not its like primary source of food, but it's something it will totally take a hold of if it gets the chance. And that's really cool. Or it also it could have really weird defense mechanisms. Like if it's using chemosynthesis, it might have access to all kinds of acids or other chemical, like it might literally engage in chemical warfare. It might create mustard gas or something like that it releases into the water around it, or whatever the local equivalent of it is at the bottom of the ocean. And so, you could see it, maybe it kills fish. So like as you're getting closer to this thing, like you just see like fish floating to the top of the sea as corpses, and like it's killed all of the life for miles and miles around. And that like before you even encounter this thing, it's got this like warning, this premonition as like the sea around it dies, Oh,
that's a very cool visual image for just like you just see these sailors approaching bunch of like masses on the surface, and like, oh, that's a dolphin, that's a whale, that's a giant squid.
Yep, that's a whale with a tentacle wrapped around it. That's really cool. Yeah, and you can imagine like, oh god, okay, so if this thing's this thing is fractal in nature, then these tentacles are going to look weird close up. Like,
oh yeah,
you'll see one floating in the water. Maybe it would look like a jellyfish or something like that, like a mass of these little tiny tentacles, and then as it wraps around your boat, you'll realize that each one of those tentacles then also has small tentacles coming off of it. And then each of those little bits, what looks like fur on them, but is actually other small tentacles. And like it has the same structure all the way down to the single cell level, is really cool.
I'm picturing, I forget the name of the worm, but like they basically like throw up their stomach in like a branching pattern.
It's a kind of flatworm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ribbon worm.
I think it's the proboscis worm.
Yeah, like that. That's an excellent visual image. I will make sure we include that as well. Yeah. So the proboscis worm is a good example of something what this might look like when it gets close to when it starts to deploy more of its tentacles and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that sort of branching tree-like structure, but like instead of being smooth, it looks like it's got fur because of each of the small tentacles that are coming off of the surface of it. And each of those, like could look cloudy, like very gross.
And I love the idea that like as it gets like more and more nutrients, like these branching tentacles just become larger over time and start branching further.
Precisely. And so each individual section of it is a mirror of the being as a whole. And so as it gets more nutrients, as it grows, it just gets bigger and bigger. And then those things branch more and more. And it gets more complex and more complex. I like it. I also love the idea of it, like, if it's killing the sea around it, it might also be starting to like if it grabs a hold of your boat, it might start to sort of digest the boat as it's like grabbing onto it as well. And so you could see like these tentacles wrapping around the hull and then like acid eating away at the surface of the wood, breaking it down. And if you touch it, it like burns your hand because it's actually just trying to digest you. That's gross.
Yeah, that's awful.
That. Yeah. And I do like this as a, it's a monster, but it's not an agent. It's not it's not thinking about what it's going to do. It's not even really like trying to do anything. It's just reacting on a cellular level to the environment that it's in. And it just happens to be in entirely the wrong environment when we encounter it. That's very cool. So what's the end game on this thing? Does it die of natural causes just because it's out of its environment, or does it grow exponentially because it maybe, it's super efficient, or I don't know. What do we think?
I feel like it's probably like a doomed creature once parts of once it detaches or reaches the surface of it. I also like the idea that like it's not necessarily, it doesn't have a lifespan like we're familiar. If a part of it dies, whatever, it'll just like a tree limb that's been cut, it'll regrow and reform the loss. But if it loses a piece of itself, that piece is still active until it either secures a new food source or dies off.
Right. So this thing, quote unquote, reproduces by just breaking off pieces of itself and saying that it's floating. And it's not even doing that. It just happens to happen from time to time as like it gets caught in an earthquake or something like that. But that the main mass of it is essentially immortal. It's just going to keep doing what it's doing down at the bottom of the ocean forever. And then occasionally when something bad happens, a tidal wave or an earthquake or something like that happens, a chunk of it falls off. And if it doesn't find another geothermal vent to be part of, then chunks of it float to the surface and become just dangerous to the world around them. That's very cool. I want to throw a little wrench into that, which is maybe as it's dying, maybe it doesn't die like a single organism. Chunks of it start to die and it starts to break apart into smaller and smaller bits. And then some of those bits sink in the water. And they're still living. They're just in the process of starving to death or whatnot. They start to sink, and those are the ones that often float to new geothermal vents, is because it's breaking apart into tiny little bits that are acting like a spore cloud or something like that. But that also means that if there have been historical occurrences of things like rains of fish and such, which is when a storm, specifically something with a tornado or water spout, literally picks up animals out of the water and can hurl them around in the sky for quite a long time and then drop them over the land because the pressure system changes when it hits the shore. So you can imagine chunks of this thing being picked up out of the water, and none of them are going to be that big, but they're all going to be dangerous and really gross and falling out of the sky on a coastal city.
So what you're telling me is the end game for 2020 is the Leviathan storm.
Yep. The rain of tentacles. Monster NATO.
Oh God.
Oh yeah. No, thank you. The wormicane? I don't know. Anyway. I hope we didn't just think something that's going to happen into being.
Not exactly what I want credit for, but
yeah. So this is not so much a creature with its own arc. It's not something you have to do battle with. You just kind of have to get out of its way and let it die of its own.
Yeah, it's more like a natural phenomenon, like a volcano eruption or something.
Or just a disaster, something that could happen or that you've got to be on the lookout for. So you can almost think of this, if this has been happening for as long, in whatever world that we're talking about, maybe this is a version of Earth where this happens. You can kind of imagine that sailors might have legends about this, things that you need to be on the lookout for. So like things like various visual images that would have sort of survived in legend, sort of like mermaids and things like that, where like somebody saw a thing and they're trying to communicate that to other sailors through legend, and it just gets warped over time. So things like when the sea turned to a forest and things like that because they saw the tentacles off in the distance.
I love that image.
Yeah. Or if this thing is from the deep in the depths of the ocean, down there, almost everything photoluminesces in various ways for various purposes. So you could see this as like you could have them talk about being wary of the glowing sea and stuff like that. Like if you see just a little bit of it, it's okay. That may just be algae, like a single path of it. But if you see the entire sea glowing, then you're f***ed and you need to go now.
This kind of brings to mind the ideas of Norse mythology with Yggdrasil, the world tree.
Ooh.
Or if there's like some bioluminescent tree that rises up out of the ocean.
So do we create a thing that is both Jormungandr and Yggdrasil at the same time?
Yes.
I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah. Describing it as, somebody seeing this might describe it as like, I saw the roots of the world tree underneath the surface of the ocean or something like that.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other people seeing the same creature might say, oh no, that's those are the many heads of a hydra, or the monstrous form of Charybdis, or any number of other things. This could be this is the Leviathan and it's the Kraken. This is This could answer a lot of different things. That's very cool.
Like with it not being a direct threat so much, is there like any ecological niche for it? Is there anything humanity could gain from harnessing?
Ooh. Well, obviously, at our level of development, you could be on the lookout for you could use this as an indicator of where geothermal vents might be. And geothermal vents are a source of energy. So there's that. I don't know if it could be turned into a food source. That depends. I mean, on people eat almost anything, but.
Well, he's talking about the toxins or acids and whatnot. That it doesn't sound particularly edible.
No, I don't think that's something that we're like going to spend a lot of time eating. It could theoretically. Like if when it is shed from the earth, from the ocean's floor, if it pulls up chunks of mineral with it, it could be that like maybe mineral rich rocks like are embedded in its skin, in its surface.
Oh yeah.
That you could harvest.
Like when you pull up like a tree root or something and there's just all that soil and stuff clung to it. But in this case, like it would be something, miles wide possibly.
Yeah. It could pull up old shipwrecks with it, would be kind of cool.
Oh, that'd be cool, yeah.
Yeah, and that can't be super common, but it'd be neat. Yeah. And then like, I do like the idea of, I mean, if this thing's got acidic blood or something like that, or it's covered in chemicals and toxins and stuff, there are lots of people or lots of industries that might need stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Like if we're dealing with a fantasy world, maybe it's one of those things like various chemicals from these creatures are used in alchemical concoctions and potions and things.
Oh yeah.
And so
Leviathan's blood just sounds like an awesome reagent.
Yeah, exactly. And so, this could be one of those things that like it's dangerous to go searching for one of these things, but if you can get in and get chunks of it and harvest some of that and bring it back to alchemists, they pay, it's worth its weight in gold and stuff like that. That could be really cool. And if you're dealing with a world that has magic in it, maybe there is something magical about these creatures too. Like we've described them entirely along biological terms right now. Mm-hmm. And nothing that we've described is real, but it isn't outside of the realm of the envelope of the possible, Mm-hmm. But if this thing is magical, then maybe you could like use this, like imagine what kind of demonic spell you could cast by sacrificing a Leviathan.
Oh yeah.
Like, a god who wants an entire Leviathan as tribute is really cool. Like that's a neat story as well.
Oh yeah.
Or it could also be one of those things where if we're talking about a fantastical realm as well, up till now, this has just been sort of a big biological creature, but maybe the big Leviathans, each tiny little bit of it is not intelligent. It's a worm, and then a branch of it is a octopus. It's intelligent for an animal, but not intelligent. But if you get one of the full-sized ones and you get in contact with it, it's an intelligence that's older than time. This is a great old one then in a lot of ways. And it's completely unconcerned with our needs and wants, but it knows things and can be asked. You can ask questions of it and things like that. Like, talk about, I remember when the continents weren't shaped the way they are now. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's a powerful psionic or psychic or something like that. And it knows things because it's in touch with the earth or something. That could be very cool. There's lots of different realms to take that if you're going to go into a fantasy realm with it.
Oh, yeah.
And if you're going to go in a more sci-fi realm with it, you could say like, oh yeah, this thing, like it's an immortal creature. So just getting some of its DNA and getting some of its cells that we can study in a lab will tell us all kinds of interesting things about cancer development and cures for diseases and how to fight aging and things like that, because we can look at a creature that has not subject to any of those things and cultivate it. So that's another reason where like if you're in a modern setting where somebody might be sent out to go seek this thing, that could be really cool.
Yeah.
And that's got a kind of a Dan Brown element to it where like your protagonists could be looking at different cultural depictions of something and trying to piece together the information they need about the actual creature that all of these legends are about. And so like, you're hearing the legend about the time that the sea turned into the forest and that the various versions of, the Kraken and the Leviathan and all these things. And they're piecing it together as like, oh yeah, this is a creature that lives in this particular, it lives off the coast of Iceland because there happens to be a geothermal vent off the coast of Iceland. And so you're using that as a way to track it through history in order to go down beneath the surface and look for it.
Oh, that's a cool idea. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a hell of a story. It's got kind of a sphere vibe to it or something like that. It kind of Michael Crichton-ish quality. If you wanted to start it off as a normal story where they're just trying to get a hold of this thing, a fresh sample of it, so they can take it back to a lab and study it, and then they get down to the sea floor and they find out that it is powerfully psychic and that it is incredibly intelligent and it just doesn't care about us. But that when you get close to it, you start coming under its effects and like it can talk to you in your mind and things like that. That's wild.
Oh yeah. What kind of motivations would a creature like this have?
I don't know. The challenge of that would be to make it super alien to us. Like, cause this is like, I've often thought like how weird would an octopus be to talk to? Cause like octopi are quite intelligent, but like they're nothing like humans. And this thing is not even necessarily an animal. Like this is possibly a fungus, how strange must its kind of intelligence be?
Yeah. And if it's not, and like, if it seems like the only thing it's concerned with is just finding more nutrient through heat and chemosynthesis.
Yeah.
Then like, is its ultimate goal just to like seek out all the heat on Earth, or
maybe, or maybe it's one of those things where like it recognizes its own, that it knows about things, like it's able to sort of sit there and reason with itself and like think logically and sort of ponder. And so it's thought about a lot of stuff. It just doesn't have a lot of motivation to do anything about them because it has everything that its base desires want. Like it has no, like it might not even understand the concept of pleasure and pain because it doesn't actually hurt it when parts of it break off. That's just part of its life cycle.
Yeah.
And like it has no reason to seek anything out. Like its arms and crevice seeking tentacles and everything like that, they act in a way that are instinctual, but like it doesn't necessarily just derive pleasure. And so it's just kind of thinking all of the time. Like its intelligence might be an emergent property and not even like an evolutionary thing. Like it's just something that happens when these things get big enough, and it's sort of sit there. It's left to its own devices to sort of contemplate. Like one thing it might do is just be like an incredible mathematician. It's like sat there doing proofs inside its head for 10, 15,700 billion million years or whatever like that. It's just sat there thinking, but it has no reason to do anything with that. It may not even be in full control of its own like individual tentacles. Like that would be like you or I controlling individual cells, right? Like you don't have control over your stomach lining. That's all just happening.
You don't know that.
I'm presuming. And so like, it's not even like necessarily in control of its body, but it is the intelligence within is sort of an emergent property of all of these independent, versions of itself connected together.
Oh, I like that. That is kind of a cool idea where it's just an intelligence without like a motivation.
Yes. And like reasoning with, like, having a conversation with that creature must be wild. Like, trying to get it, like, it doesn't necessarily have a reason to answer your questions because it doesn't even, maybe it doesn't even understand what, like, that's kind of interesting. I like the idea of when it comes across something that is intelligent, it doesn't know about things that aren't itself. And so
it just assumes it's more of itself?
Kind of. Like, if you were able to communicate with it, it might think that you're a voice in its head.
Interesting. That's a really cool idea.
Yeah, it's wild. I'm not sure how that develops, but it's a neat concept. Yeah, where it's just so used to sort of sitting there thinking to itself. It's this giant collective intelligence.
Or maybe it assumes like any thoughts it encounters or communication encounters is its own thoughts. And it's just like, and it takes those as absolute truth.
Could be. Like,
so it's something that you could manipulate to whatever end.
It could. Although I'm not sure what you could get out of this thing if it's not in control of itself. Other than maybe it's got a proof for Fermat's Lost theorem or something like that it can provide you with. But yeah, it's wild. It's one of those things, like, you'd have to almost get into the specifics of it. Like, you'd have to start, like, creating characters and having them interact with it to sort of see how things develop. I'm not sure that we can just, like, because there's no wrong answer because there's no right answer here. So you can go in lots and lots of different ways with it. The possibilities are almost endless. That's very cool. Yeah, I like that. I'm not sure where else to go on this idea. Like, we're in such wild territory now.
Yeah, like at this point, it's almost like just a weird branching computer.
Yeah. Ooh, having one of those be the computer of, like, a magic tech society. Like,
oh yeah,
you've got a culture of mermaids or something like that have their city built around one of these things, and that, like, it's their, like, central repository. It's like it's the intelligence that runs their civilization. It's their leader or something like that. Or maybe it's just something that they consult every now and again because it just happens to be very, very intelligent and it's useful to have.
What if its ideas are distributed throughout its being? Like, there's not like a core intelligence. So to, like, shape the reasoning and understanding of this creature, like this mermaid culture or Atlantean culture or whatever, is pruning this Leviathan.
Oh, I saw where you were going with that. I love it. That's fantastic. Yeah, they're literally, they maybe even have, like, developed a pruning programming language, something that they can they figure out, okay, if you do damage to it in these ways, then it starts to think in the way that you're expecting it to, and you're able to guide it over time.
Of course, because all the branches work on sort of an instinctual level, trying to do so is very dangerous.
Oh yeah. And, like, it's just a dangerous thing to have around all the time because it produces toxins and stuff like that. So you have to come up with ways to manage it. And, like, maybe they've got, I'm like imagining them having whatever the underwater equivalent of a sailing ship is. Like, it's basically a submarine, except it doesn't have air inside. Like, it's just an underwater ship. But at the core of it is a branching section of this Leviathan that they have pruned to be compact, and it acts as their ship, like the main computer of their ship, you know?
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
That's really cool.
Just this highly toxic Leviathan core to your ship.
Yeah. And if it's not carefully maintained and managed, it, like, goes wild and becomes dangerous to its crew. But at the same time, you can, like, maybe they even cultivate this Leviathan creature by taking sections of it to geothermal vents that they can then implant it into in order to grow and have separate versions of and things.
I'm also kind of picturing like basically, instead of, like, this being like a super, like, high-tech ship or whatever, like, they have like this old school locomotive forge, like, fires going that they're just, like, shoveling coal into to fuel this heat source.
Yeah, exactly.
To feed the Leviathan.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, I think we've done as much with this as we can. This is too cool. Awesome. Well, that's it. Bye.
All right. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Monster Mechanics. If you're enjoying our show, it would help us out if to leave us a rating or review inside Apple or Podchaser. We thrive on your feedback. Now for the credits. Monster Mechanics is produced and edited by me, Scott Paladin, and hosted by myself and my best friend, Zach Jaquays. All of the ideas generated during this podcast are released under a Do What the F You Want public license.